On to today, and we're very lucky to have Sophie Richardson with us from Human Rights Watch, all the way from Washington, D.C. I sort of felt that by the end of 2016, not much could shock me anymore. I'm not sure if anyone else in the room has sort of political exhaustion at this point in the year. But China, in terms of the news recently, has actually had a lot of positive things going on. We've seen Xi Jinping on the world stage looking very comfortable compared to a lot of other global leaders. We've also continued to hear about the war on corruption. And then yesterday here in Hong Kong, we had the stock exchange link kickoff, which also started to spell out some of the issues that are going on in southern China when it comes to the tech industry. Well, today's discussion goes back to human rights in China. And the Human Rights Watch is releasing a report just now called Special Measures, Detention and Torture in the Chinese Communist Party's Shuanggui System. Sophie's here to tell us all about it, and as ever, we'll have Q&A. Just to give you some background on Sophie, she's based in Washington, D.C. She is a specialist and author of many reports on China's political system and human rights, and also extends her work into Southeast Asia. It's a pleasure to introduce Sophie.
Thank you very much, and first and foremost, our sincere thanks to our friends at the FCC for hosting this event today. China, as many of you well know, faces a serious problem with corruption, and President Xi Jinping has, to a considerable extent, staked the legitimacy of his rule on bringing all corrupt tigers and flies to heel. Recently, Xinhua announced that authorities have investigated more than 1 million people in the context of his signature anti-corruption campaign, and it now seems weekly news that allegedly corrupt party members voluntarily return from other countries to face scrutiny in China. If these cases were being pursued through an independent judiciary with full fair trial rights for the defendants and under the watchful gaze of an independent media, they might indeed have a transformative effect. Yet the anti-corruption campaign depends at least in part on the Chinese Communist Party's powerful and secretive Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, the CCDI, and its unlawful Shuanggui system. The report we're releasing today, Special Measures, which is based on interviews, media reports, and the Supreme People's Court's database, looks at detention and torture in that system. What is Shuanggui? It is the CCP's legally baseless practice of detaining, interrogating, and coercing confessions from party members who are thought to have engaged in corruption or otherwise violated party rules. All 88 million CCP members, not just government officials, but also executives in the banking system, engineers in state-owned companies, even popular entertainers and sports coaches, can be subjected to this abuse. And the fear of being put in Shuanggui cuts across cadres at all levels. In its 2014 review of China, the UN Committee Against Torture identified Shuanggui as a form of arbitrary detention, a determination we agree with. How does Shuanggui start? Often, as interviewees told us, with a disappearance. Typically, officials from a local CDI, the lower level bodies of the CCDI, will arrange to meet the suspect, sometimes at the person's office or home, and telling them that they must accompany them to discuss work-related matters or that they must help with an investigation. It's often not clear to the suspect that they are going to be subjected to Shuanggui. At the time, one interviewee told us, "I thought I was only assisting an investigation. I did not know if it was about me or somebody else. 2 days after I went, they announced that I had been put in Shuanggui." Detainees are taken away to unknown, unmarked facilities, hotels, offices, or other government buildings. An interviewee told us, "The Shuanggui location has 4 signs. One says something like the so-and-so Literature Society, but none had anything to do with the CDI. There, people are interrogated about corruption and other violations of party rules and held indefinitely. The longest detention we documented was 14 months, typically until they confess. Family members are usually not informed by the CDI that a person is being held. We found little evidence that Shuanggui detainees were given an opportunity to contact a lawyer. Our interviewees detailed the following abuses in Shuanggui: prolonged sleep deprivation, being forced to hold stress positions for long periods, the denial of food and water, beatings, extreme temperatures, and around-the-clock monitoring. One interviewee told us, "All of my actions, including urinating and defecating, required their permission, and they watched me every minute." The very nature, the purpose of Shuanggui is to hold people incommunicado and alone, to terrify them into confessing. One CDI officer wrote that the mental stress on detainees is more than enormous. In cases I've handled, generally they collapse after persevering for 3 to 5 days, and they'd answer everything you'd ask. Guards appear to be particularly concerned that detainees not be able to kill themselves, a prospect at least 3 interviewees had described to us having thought about. Party rules require that Shuanggui facilities have protections, such as padded walls, to prevent suicides. In examining Chinese state media reports, we found 11 cases of individuals who died while in Shuanggui. Authorities said all were of the result of natural causes, suicides, or unspecified accidents, but family members suspected torture or other signs that were inconsistent with the official explanations. Shuanggui's abusive nature extends to the ill treatment of detainees' family members. 5 interviewees said that detainees' family members were also taken into custody as part of the investigation. 11 told us that CDI officers demanded that their families return the money their detainee relatives allegedly took, and were told that complying would lead to better treatment for or the release of their family members, which in fact turned out to be a tactic authorities used to bolster the veracity of their allegations against the detainees. Shuanggui typically only ends after a detainee confesses to corruption or other disciplinary violations, at which point he or she is often brought into the criminal justice system, convicted and sentenced to a typically lengthy term. But at this point, another serious problem becomes clear, that although the CCDI investigators and the state prosecutors, the procuratorate, are not meant to work together, the two in fact frequently collaborate. Many interviewees told us that rather than procurators launching fresh investigations, procurators often participated directly in CCDI investigations, to the extent that Shuanggui detainees did not know to whom they were confessing. Procurators simply asked detainees to repeat the confessions they have made in Shuanggui, but this time for formal judicial proceedings. When some of the detainees tried to retract their statements during criminal proceedings, claiming torture or coercion during Shuanggui, procurators responded by threatening to return them to Shuanggui. One former detainee tried to confront her captors, saying, "I told them the rights we are entitled to, and they said, 'We are the CDI officers. The law doesn't apply to us.'" Another problem crops up at the trial stage, where judges routinely dismiss detainees' complaints, stating that what happened to them in the Shuanggui system is outside the scope of the judicial system and therefore cannot be taken into consideration. Are there any limits on Shuanggui? In theory, yes, and those include that Shuanggui is only meant to be used in complex or important cases in which the CDI has evidence and in which a certain amount of money or more has been involved. In theory, Shuanggui is only meant to be carried out by those who are quote-unquote politically reliable, with 2 or more investigators present and for limited amounts of time. And in theory, rooms used by CDIs for Shuanggui, you can see an image of one of these facilities on the back cover of the report, are supposed to be designed with security features and on the ground floors of buildings. But to the extent that anyone, especially the detainees, are even aware of these limitations, they have no real recourse to challenge violations of them. Shuanggui provides a highly convenient platform for the party and the procurators. The former gets to decide which cases it wants to go ahead in the formal legal system, while the latter gets to skirt the minimum protections afforded to criminal suspects, both with the goal of coercing confessions and both with near total impunity. Judges essentially act as rubber stamps on cases already decided by the CDIs. Acquittals are extremely rare, and except in a few cases of detainee deaths, few investigators face punishment for these abuses. Ironically, while the CCDI has imposed increasingly strict controls on internal approval procedures for Shuanggui since the system's inception in the 1990s, it remains opaque about basic information, including the 2012 directive that supposedly outlines these better protections, or the number of people who are subjected to Shuanggui each year. But the numbers we've pulled together from state media, so as you all know, take these with a grain of salt, suggest that not a small number of people are trapped in the black hole of Shuanggui. In 2015, CDIs investigated 333,000 cases, which is more than double the number of 2005 investigations. punished internally 360,000 individuals, which is about triple the number from 2005, and referred about 14,000 cases to procuratorate for prosecution. These figures are all in the report. In an October speech, anti-corruption czar and Politburo Standing Committee member Wang Qishan complained that nearly every official that has been investigated refused to cooperate. And I think it's not hard to see why. Perhaps that is what has prompted the CCDI to launch pilot projects in Beijing, Shanxi, and Zhejiang to set up a new and more powerful anti-corruption body. This body, which is also led by the party, would, quote, consolidate anti-corruption resources, expand the scope of supervision, and expand the monitoring to all public officials, so presumably beyond just party members. The exact institutional designs are unclear, and there's no reference to Shuanggui, but it does appear that the CCDI will remain at the center of this process. Ultimately, the Shuanggui system undermines the fight against corruption and violates the rights to liberty, to fair trials, and to be free of torture. Relying on a legally baseless, opaque party mechanism to investigate corruption cases cedes the power to investigate and detain people to unaccountable political figures and leeches the little credibility that remains in the formal judicial system. Who knows whether those million people Xinhua says have been probed were actually guilty of breaking the law based on credible evidence, or whether they were simply at the wrong end of a political vendetta. President Xi calls regularly and vigorously for adherence to the rule of law, including as a means for getting to grips with corruption. But for the anti-corruption campaign to gain legitimacy and have any sort of positive and lasting effect, particularly on the judicial system, the first urgent step is to abolish Shuanggui. Quite simply, political parties, especially political parties in a one-party state, should not run their own detention systems. All of those currently held in Shuanggui should be released immediately. Their family members should be informed of their whereabouts, and the detainees should have access to lawyers and to independent doctors. The National People's Congress's Standing Committee should move swiftly to revise the law on administrative supervision to abolish Shuanggui and ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which has awaited ratification by China for almost 2 decades. Finally, enormous work remains to be done in ensuring the rights of all suspects across the country. Authorities have a chance to right a slew of grave wrongs, and we encourage them to seize that opportunity. As a way of giving you a sense of how isolating and frightening the experience of having a family member in Shuanggui can be, we'd just like to share a short video with you that we've produced, and after that, I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks.
我想说的就是，首先，我们这个国家需要有法治，所有的事情都是应该按照法律来的。如果不按法律来的话，每个人就会无法无天的话，每个人其实都是受害者。如果他是贪官，你要通过正常的司法程序来。这个事情不是我一家人的事情，是很多很多人的事情，哪怕一点点也是好的。
I'm Florence de Changy, reporter with Le Monde and the French National Radio. Actually, I'm just wondering, in your view, what is the point of such an unfair system? But because when we see this lady, if the husband is a good official in this county, who benefits from torturing and putting in this Shuanggui system innocent people? I don't understand the logic of it.
I'm not sure I do either. We're speculating a little bit here about what the underlying logic is, but I think the evidence suggests that Shuanggui is a very convenient tool for the party at different levels to exact fear against all party members. You know, the one consistent theme throughout our research was how much people feared this system, even if they hadn't been anywhere near it themselves. But I think it's also a very convenient screening mechanism for the party to decide which cases should go on into the formal legal system and won't cause further embarrassment, or where putting a case forward into the legal system will make the party look good as opposed to look bad. And because there's so little transparency, you know, it's hard to know how the cases that didn't go forward in the legal system actually turned out. but it essentially gives the party that much more power to decide what is known about corruption and who's actually prosecuted. You know, I think one of the questions that we really can't answer is whether the people who've been prosecuted actually should have been, and whether lots of people who should have been haven't. So Shuanggui sort of functions as this very effective way of screening these cases, frightening other people. And I think to some extent there's probably a certain amount of buck passing, the ability to foist blame off on somebody who's politically weaker than you are, because they have no way of really challenging that. But one of the central claims that we're trying to challenge here is that President Xi and Wang Qishan and others have spoken repeatedly in public about the confidence that they have in China's legal system, to which we say, if you're so confident, then why do you need to do this? Why not just send these cases through the regular judicial system? If you have the evidence, present it to a prosecutor, have them investigate. If it's credible, it goes to court. You don't need this shadowy system in which people are horrifically abused to try to answer that larger problem about corruption.
Right over here. We've got the microphone over there, so we'll start there and we'll come to you. Sorry.
Thanks. Phoebe Smith from the Australian Consulate. You mentioned just then that the rhetoric about the rule of law and the anti-corruption campaign has been really strong in the last year, but that this system has been in place since the 1990s. Have you been monitoring numbers for that whole period? And also, I guess my next question is about where you see the anti-corruption campaign heading, and you made some references then about what you think might be motivating it, and the fact that this system still exists would suggest that the anti-corruption campaign is more about power and political consolidation of power rather than real criminal justice motivation. So any comments on that I'd appreciate.
Sure. On the first point about numbers, I think everybody in this room who works on China knows that the numbers that one finds in government reports or in the official media are not necessarily ones you want to bet the farm on. What we did pull together, and it's on page 15 of the hard copies of the report, does suggest a significant increase in the number of cases going into Shuanggui, or at least referred by the CCDI, in the same period that roughly coincides with Xi Jinping's tenure. And I think we can reasonably conclude that because Shuanggui is so central to the anti-corruption campaign, that as that's gone on, the use of this system, that there's been more recourse to this particular system. As for the future of the anti-corruption campaign, I think as long as this remains a priority for the political leadership, this system will remain in use. It's such an incredibly convenient way to remove your political opponents and their allies from the equation. That why would you give it up? These pilot programs that the CCDI has announced, on the one hand makes you think maybe there is a live discussion, as there was at various points along the way about things like re-education through labor, that this system was fundamentally problematic and that it was inimical to the longer term goals of strengthening the legal system and prosecuting cases according to credible law and legal standards and procedures. But I think the end result of the discussion about those pilot projects and what it sounds like they will involve actually pulls in the other direction and shows the CCDI actually claiming more territory for itself, not trying to put itself out of business or really bring Shuanggui either under the control of some credible or slightly more credible part of the legal system, or simply abolishing it. And I think that's an alarming trend. It's a bit like what we saw with the growth of the security forces from the 2008 Olympics onward, that these entities really metastasized in their power and the role that they played in how the state was run. And I think we're about to see the same thing happen with the CCDI.
We had a question here.
Hi, Benjamin House from The Guardian. So I was curious if you had any sense how often, because a lot of the officials, especially lower level officials, are sort of brought in to report up on their superiors. So do you have any sense of, is pleaing out effective, or do they get lesser sentences, or are they eventually released if they sort of give the CCDI a big enough fish?
Yeah, I should, it's a hard question to answer, and I should state or reiterate here that we're in no position to comment on the claims of guilt or innocence in any of these cases. Our point is really that nobody, including corrupt Chinese Communist Party officials, should be denied basic fair trial rights or tortured. I don't think I'm just thinking back over the details of the interviews and sort of the relative levels of people we talk to or their family members. I don't think we've got enough information to really answer that question well. I think the larger point, though, or maybe what I can say, is that clearly this system exists in part to keep people off balance. You don't know what's going to trigger a Shuanggui investigation. You don't know really what kind of confession you have to make to get out of a Shuanggui investigation. It's the nature, it's the arbitrary nature of it. Maybe 10 years from now we'll have the data to show that cases at a certain low level came out a different way. But I think the average court sentence our interviewees, or the cases of all of the cases that we looked at, the average court sentence was about 9 years. So that's not insignificant.
We have a question right here.
Sophie, it's good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Edward Chin, columnist and activist. Now, I know you have been following a lot about on issues regarding human rights, and you have been following on the booksellers case, and Angela Gui testified in the U.S. Congress. Lam Wen-kei is released now in Hong Kong. Li Po shuts up. And what happened to Mr. Gui Wenhai? Is there anything that your group is still doing? Would he be released? How long? Is he going to be detained forever?
I wish I was in a position to definitively answer that question. We obviously think he should never have been detained in the first place and that he should be released immediately. We continue to call on the Chinese government to release him. We continue to encourage the Swedes and the European Union to continue asking for his release. I have to say, working with Angela Gui has been a remarkable experience. I think she has campaigned with great dignity and courage for her dad's release. I think there will have to be a penalty imposed for failing to release him. I think the Chinese government remains a highly transactional regime that generally only responds in cases like these to the threat of some sort of negative consequences. And the question then becomes whether Sweden, the EU, and others are willing to threaten that kind of consequence to see him freed.
Would there be a trial?
That's a great question. There's no indication of that moving forward as far as I know, unlike some of the other cases that we track. Like, for example, some of the 709 people who are still awaiting some vague judicial process. There have been, I think, 1 or 2 visits to him in which he said that he doesn't necessarily want the attention. I think it's very hard to believe that those statements are made absent coercion.
Question right here.
Tony Watson, Hong Kong Society of Financial Analysts. Is there any indication that this system has overseas reach? Specifically, have there been cases where Communist Party officials have been reindicted from overseas locations back to China to face investigation, or interrogated in overseas countries, or moved to third countries where they're interrogated?
Let me try to break that down, because I think there are about 3 different components to that question. Certainly there have been some very solid media reports that allegedly corrupt Chinese officials have been approached or questioned or interrogated by other Chinese officials in other countries. The scope or the scale of that, it's unclear. I think we are very skeptical about these cases of so-called voluntary returns, because I think a bit like Gui Minhai, it's really hard to imagine that those decisions are made absent coercion, pressure on people's family at home, pressure in the most recent case of somebody who volunteered to come back from the US. I'm going to forget her name. But in the media reports about her case, there were also suggestions that local people in the local community, I assume meaning either other Chinese who had moved to the US or Chinese Americans, it was not clear precisely who was being referred to, but other people had also put pressure on her to return. As far as the cases of people who have actually been sent back, had they been in Shuanggui, we don't know. Is it possible that they could be sent to Shuanggui upon return? Sure. Is this an important variable? And the existence of this system should be a variable, I think, in government's decisions about whether to send people back and whether, whether and what kind of well-founded fear of persecution they might encounter upon return. I think we are quite concerned about how some of these cases are playing out beyond China's borders, and whether the people who make these determinations really understand not just the flaws in the formal judicial system, but that the Chinese government and the party have a lot of other cards to play against people if they're sent back.
Sort of just following on from that question, if I may, especially the issues of going beyond China's borders with these types of detentions and questioning. What sort of reaction are you getting when you testify in the European Union or the United States about issues like this? Is it inaction? Is there a sense that action is being taken or investigations are being undertaken in Europe and the United States about this?
Well, I would make a distinction between how members of parliament and members of Congress respond to these discussions as opposed to how governments respond. Certainly there are members of the US Congress and the European Parliament who are absolutely stalwart in following human rights issues in China, and who try to travel to the region. They adopt resolutions. The European Parliament has done some great resolutions this year condemning abuses. These are precisely the people who will invite individuals like, for example, Angela Gui to come and testify. I think it's difficult for those individuals to legislatively oblige their governments to behave differently, because on both sides of the Atlantic, these are relatively small groups of people. These are parts of the world where the Chinese government has not just extensive diplomatic and political ties, but now extensive investment. And, members of Parliament and Congress at the end of the day, as a group at least, have to make hard choices about how critical they think they can be at the risk of losing investment in their districts. If you looked at, I forget who it was who produced a map a couple of years ago showing Chinese state investment by congressional district in the US. And there was not an insignificant correlation. This is an unscientific opinion, but from my perspective, there was an obvious correlation, with a few exceptions, to the relative amount of public attention individual members of Congress would put on human rights issues. I think that's not, that's a real factor for governments.
Which leads to the question of, given the change of political winds that we're seeing all over the world, are you deeply concerned that human rights is going to move down the ladder in terms of priorities?
I think it's not just that it has become harder over the past 10 years for different governments to organize themselves and advance tough policies in support of human rights. I think it's also that, not only does nature abhor a vacuum, boy does the Chinese Communist Party, and it is very willing to step forward internationally now and try to dictate international standards on things like online content, on issues like academic freedom, on issues like what constitutes torture. So it's not just, I think, that sort of the traditional defenders of human rights in China, meaning other governments, have faced a much tougher time in Beijing. I think it's that Beijing is behaving much more aggressively in these ways in international forums beyond its borders.
Sorry, I took up time. More questions from the audience and media over here. Any more questions? Right here.
I'm Tohan Shi, a reporter from MLX. I just noticed China has recently arrested some nationals of other countries and Australian casino employees and this British risk consultant called Peter Humphrey. But what I've noticed is that, it has not hurt diplomatic relations between China and the countries like Britain and Australia. Do you have any? And then, Peter Humphrey had to make this communist-style confession on television before he went back to Britain. Do you have any comments on this?
Well, I think the detention of other national citizens in China presents those governments with, problems they're not completely unaccustomed to, but especially in cases like Li Bo's or Gui Minhai's or people like Peter Humphreys, where I think the evidence, to the extent it exists at all, may be very shaky and reflect a political agenda in locking somebody up. Are very difficult for those governments to deal with. I think there's a lot more pressure brought to bear on them to ensure that their nationals are treated well and brought home. But to be honest, I am equally concerned about some of the citizens of other countries. For example, these cases involving Taiwanese who were allegedly involved in certain kinds of telecoms fraud, who are working in places like Kenya, being sent to the mainland without, it's not legally impossible to do that, but Kenya and other governments have failed to give those people an opportunity to contest their deportation to the mainland before a competent court. And that's enormously problematic. If Chinese authorities get to go around the world and say, we don't like you, we're mad at you, we think you've broken our laws and you're coming with us now, that's a pretty horrifying development that I think needs to be arrested very quickly.
Thanks. Florence.
Since we have time, how do you compare this system in China that you described with some other systems in the region, like ISA in Singapore, the new anti-subversion law that have replaced it and that are even worse in Malaysia, and some other system elsewhere where arrest with no legal basis? And I don't know to which extent the Patriot Act fits in as well, because it's also arrest without legal basis, right?
Right. Yeah, I think maybe the best way to answer that is to tell you exactly what international law, and to some extent Chinese law, requires, which is that the only people who should be doing the detaining are police. An agency that is fully constituted by and has the authority of the state, not a political party. Cases should be tried by the formal judicial system with full due process rights. They should not be effectively determined by, the CDIs, for example. And people simply can't be denied the right to a lawyer or the evidence that's presented against them or the opportunity to really defend themselves. And so any system, whether it's Shuanggui, the Patriot Act or the ISA, would fall short of that. I do think that the Shuanggui system is something of a standout, both because it is so anachronistic and because it applies to all party members. I mean, there are 8 million more Chinese Communist Party members than there are Germans. It's not a small pool of people who are potentially eligible for this treatment, and because it comes at a time when the government wants to tell the rest of the world that it has a perfectly functional legal system. And again, if you have a perfectly functional legal system, it should be capable of prosecuting these kinds of cases regardless of people's political status.
Actually, I wanted to clarify something about, you say it only applies to members of the Communist Party?
Correct.
So that would almost be a reason not to have your card, right?
Oh, sorry, a reason not to...
Not to be a member of the party.
Well,
I mean, are you free of this kind of threat if you're not a member of the party, for what you
No,
understand?
I mean, we've written extensively and released reports here about the many and serious flaws in the formal judicial system as well. Then there are some very strong parallels about ill treatment, about the inability to get evidence obtained through torture thrown out in court. There's some very consistent pathologies, but at least in the formal judicial system, there are rules on the books that people should be able to access a lawyer, that they should not be treated in certain ways, that they have to be held at official facilities. And those do present a modicum of protection for the defense. So I don't want to suggest that not being a party member means that you will always be tried fairly. We're a long way away from that goal too, but the existence of the Shuanggui system, I think, puts even, further undermines reaching that goal of a really functional, credible legal system.
Thanks. We've just gone to 2 o'clock, so thank you very much. I believe there are copies of your report plus the press release at the entrance. As ever, from the FCC, we'd like to present you with a small gift, and thank you for coming today.
It's just